Thank you, Mr. Jenkinson. As he said, my name is Simon Root, and I'm a sophomore mathematics major from Wasilla, Alaska, and I'm also a TR scholar. And I consider it my privilege today to announce our next speaker. Mr. Josh Reyes, you may have seen him walking around. He's the fellow with the badge and the small furry creatures falling around behind him. Hails from Maryland, for which I must express certain condolences regarding the rough patch that his Ravens are going through at present. But he holds a master's degree in history from New York's Long Island University. Of course, Mr. Reyes is very enthusiastic about history, but it is his real love for the outdoors that led him to become a park ranger at Sagamore Hill National Historic Site, which is, of course, the Roosevelt family home. It has been here that Mr. Reyes has developed his passion for the great man that was Teddy Roosevelt. Mr. Reyes has come all the way here to DSU, leaving his wife, his son, and his skiing expeditions to offer his unique insight onto the Roosevelt family. And so, without further ado, please welcome Mr. Josh Reyes.
Thank you, sir. Okay, I'm wireless. Can you hear me? All right. Is that better? Should the speed moved up? There we go. Better? I can hear the reverb, so you got to hear me. Okay. I will say 30 minutes is not a lot of time to talk about this topic of the Roosevelt family and the Great War. Clay will be doing a presentation on Kermit Roosevelt on Saturday, and to be honest, you could do 30 to 45 minutes on any individual child. So my hope is just to give you all a little bit of exposure and insight to some of the contributions of the Roosevelt family during the Great War, and hopefully as a result you'll come out and visit us at Sagamore Hill when we reopen next summer. I'm going to focus exclusively on the children. There were many Roosevelt family members involved in the war. Corinne's son, Monroe Douglas Robinson, Anna's son, William Sheffield. These were both Roosevelt sisters. Nicholas Roosevelt, Philip Roosevelt, they were cousins, as well as Mrs. Roosevelt's sister, Emily Tyler Carew, who was with the Italian Red Cross in the First World War. I will not really be mentioning them any, but if you have any questions, I'll be happy to talk about them after the presentation's over. In addition to the Great War Centennial happening now across Europe, the Park Service is gearing up for its centennial. And in many ways, the two are interconnected. The National Park Service is a byproduct of the First World War, it being created in 1916. And today we have 401 sites. However, 100 years ago, there was only a handful. Some of them were being actively used by the Army leading up to the war. In the case of Fort Yellowstone, which as they started to pull troops out and gear them up for Europe, they saw a need to create more of a civilian force to oversee the national parks. Places like Governor's Island, which is in New York, that's where the 1st Army Division was formed, which is the division that Theodore Roosevelt Jr. and Archie were based out of. And in this case here, this is Gettysburg, which was also still run by the War Department during World War I, and this is a tank exercise taking place on what's Pickett's Charge, location of the battlefield. Sagamore Hill was built in 1884, and it remained in the Roosevelt family until Edith's death in 1948. Sagamore Hill is most famous for being Roosevelt's summer White House. The most important event that happened at the summer White House during Roosevelt's presidency was him conducting the preliminary talks to end the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. After his presidency, the most important chain of events to take place at Sagamore Hill in that stretch of time from roughly 1884 until 1948 was the First World War. And there's a wide range of stories to share about the family and their daily occurrences around the site. 1914 was a tough year for Theodore Roosevelt. This is a photo of him returning from Brazil on the SS Aden. During that year, he was still getting over the loss of the election in 1912. He had the botched, I shouldn't call it botched because he did make it down the River of Doubt, but it was a tough journey for him that almost killed him. He had the trip down the River of Doubt. He was involved in a libel suit. And as mentioned by Mr. Thompson, there was the $25 million apology that Woodrow Wilson was offering to the Colombian government in regards to the Panama Canal. On the right, this is a photo of the entire Roosevelt family in Spain, in Madrid, for Kermit and Belle Willard's wedding. This is not the most flattering photo of Theodore Roosevelt. If you've ever seen it, I don't know if he was talking when the photo was snapped, but do take a close look at it. What's interesting about this moment in time, the wedding was June 13th, 1914. This is just 2 weeks before the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that the entire family was over in Spain. And TR had commented that even before the assassination, there was a real mood like in the air of revolution. He was observing that some of the things that he'd witnessed when he was at the king's funeral in 1910, there have been a lot of changes just in that 4 years. The rest of the family was back in the U.S. after his assassination. However, Alice and Nick Longworth continued to spend time in France, and Alice was at a horse race in Paris when word had spread that there was an assassination in Sarajevo. Alice had said that she didn't expect that to be the spark, the match to light off the spark throughout Europe. I've used this photo a lot at Sagamore Hill for holiday cards. It meant something to me 20 months ago. It was different to me 20 months ago than now because I have a 20-month-old son. I used to just think it was a great photo of the family on Christmas morning. This photo was taken Christmas 1916, and this is the last photo of the family together before everything changed within just a few months. You see all of the children, you see all of the grandchildren. And that's really the big thing I hope you take away from this talk, is that I challenge any of you to find a family during the Great War that sacrificed so much and gave so much in terms of the life of one of their children, so much money and so much time, than the Roosevelts. This is Ethel and Richard Derby. I did see this photo over there with the interpretive text. This is their engagement photo. There was no real good way to do a chronological order of the children. I'm sorry, is there no? Okay. There was no good way to do a chronological order of the children and their contributions. This is Ethel, and she was first of the children to be over in France during September of 1914. She was over there with the American Ambulance Hospital, along with her husband, Richard Derby. And as I said, we talk about sacrifice. While she's over there providing assistance in the hospital with her husband, she left her youngest son, Richard Derby Jr., behind with Theodore Roosevelt and Edith, pictured on the right. Ethel said while there, "I cannot believe that men should do things to each other." And it really changed her view of the world for the rest of her life. She got involved in numerous charitable organizations all the way up to her death, I think really because of the time that she spent in France from September 1914 to December 1914. On one of those great what-ifs in history, when Ethel and Richard Derby returned from France in December, they returned on the Lusitania, not the U.S. Lusitania, the Lusitania, just 4 months before it was sunk by a German U-boat. While she was stateside, She had said, I could think of nothing else but the terrible things I saw during my 3-month stay in Paris, and one of the organizations that she was involved with is Relief for Belgium refugees. I couldn't really find a lot of good photos of Richard Derby in his uniform, except for this one. This is Richard Derby. This is Theodore Roosevelt Jr. This is Kermit Roosevelt. This is Archie Roosevelt. This is obviously towards the end of the war because you can see Archie with his arm in a sling. Richard Derby did return, and he continued to aid the American Expeditionary Force once they entered. He had written a book reflecting on his time. It's available on the internet. It's called Wade in the Sanitary, if you're curious to see his account. His account is very much written like a doctor. When you look at any of the other children's writings or the family writings about the deaths of Theodore Roosevelt or the death of Quentin, very emotional about how they felt that day that they heard when they died. Where Richard Derby, he kind of mentions it and then moves on to the next story. He did have a close call himself in Belleau Wood when an artillery shell had exploded close to him, killing several around him. This is a 5-star pin. This was Ethel's. You can see her initials right there. The hope is with some of these artifacts I'm going to show you in this presentation, they will be shipped here. The person that was assisting me with getting these out here, he got accepted to officer candidate school, and he left kind of on the fly. So as a result, we will have these out here after this presentation. But the 5 stars are to represent the 4 brothers and Richard Derby. Allison Nicholas Longworth. Alice's contributions, I think, are captured very well in Miss Stacy Cordry's book. There's a lot of great quotes. Alice, she didn't get involved to the extent as some of the others. There's a great quote that said, no one moved without her knitting, no one except Alice. She never knitted a stitch in her entire life. Alice did start wearing slacks during the war to encourage other women to follow suit and save materials for wartime. She did involve herself in Liberty Loan drives, but she said that hosting parties at her house was a far more pleasanter experience of war work than the canteens and the Red Cross classes. Her husband, Nicholas Longworth, he had to really walk a tightrope during the war. Last night's keynote speaker had talked about the 20 million German Americans, and Roosevelt was very outspoken about the hyphenated Americans, especially German Americans during the war. Nick Longworth was on the Ways and Means Committee. He represented the 1st District in Cincinnati, congressman, and he had a very large German American base. So as a result, he didn't really touch the topic too often. This is Edith Roosevelt. Edith, no doubt, had a tough time during the war, a very melancholy husband, as well as 4 sons who were abroad. She told Kermit, I strongly feel that you all are coming home safe and sound. I cannot make it otherwise. As they were departing in April 1917, this is her 5-star pin. Unfortunately, not all the children returned. This is her Gold Star medal that she received after the death of Quentin, which is on display at Sagamore Hill. Archie Roosevelt, he probably had the toughest time during the war in terms of injuries sustained. This is a picture of him before the war on the left in the Plattsburgh camp in upstate New York. The photo in the center going back to how disruptive the war was to the family and the sacrifices they made. There's a photo of his wife Grace over his newly born son Archie Jr. When war broke out in April of 1917, Archie scrambled and married Grace Lockwood in Boston. They conceived the child. The child was born while he was overseas. Never met his child while he was in France during the war. And this is Archie when he returned home after the war. He took a he took shrapnel to his left arm and his left knee, and he needed really a cane the rest of his life. He never really recovered. These are some artifacts that we have at Sagamore Hill related to Archie. This is shrapnel and bone from Archie's knee. This would belong to his wife, Grace. It was a bracelet, and it's a photo of Archie, and up top is a photo of their son, Archie Jr. The Roosevelt boys received a great deal of medals during the war. This is, on the left is from Montenegro. On the right is the Croix de Guerre, which Archie received while he was in the hospital recovering from his wounds. Theodore Roosevelt Jr., I saw this picture, the better picture of it over there, where he's in the Plattsburgh camp providing instruction. In the center is a book. It's from an insert of a book that he wrote after the war called The Average Americans. It's also available on the web. It's a good resource. If anything I could do to help you, but if you can think of something, you must let me know. Theodore Roosevelt did eventually take a lot of pride in the fact that Eleanor did end up going to France to help out with the YMCA. When word had gotten back to him that Woodrow Wilson's son-in-law was going to France with the YMCA, he said, quote, "How very nice. We're sending our daughter-in-law to France in the YMCA as well." Once Eleanor had caught wind that the Army was going to pass a special regulation forbidding any woman from following a soldier's wife over, she scrambled and went to France. She was instructed by her husband to wait a little bit once he got there until he could see how things were, but she had went, and they had 3 children they had left behind during the war. One of them was 1, and Eleanor had said when the war had wrapped up and she returned home, her youngest son, Cornelius, who was only 1 year old, didn't even know her. And it was the same thing for Theodore Roosevelt Jr. when he was over there. General Pershing didn't approve of her being there initially, but he did award her a special citation for her service with the YMCA. She first was involved in the canteens. She did such a great job, they moved her up to the Richmond Hotel in Paris, where she was assigned to any new women that came over with the YMCA, assigning them to the various camps. This is, to the left is a post-war photo of her in her YMCA uniform. It's late 20s, early 30s. I think everybody is excited when they can fit into something they wore 10, 15 years ago, and I'm sure she felt the same. To the right is a photo of her over in France with General Parker and her husband. She played a major role for the family. Eleanor Roosevelt, you could really do an hour presentation on her contributions during the war, because Sagamore Hill created the stability on the home front for the family. Ethel lived at the home. The children, the grandchildren, were in and out of the home because Mom and Dad were always the kind of consistent force keeping the family together on the home front. That was Eleanor Roosevelt's role over in France at these relief camps. Anytime any of the boys were on leave from the front, they would go spend time with Eleanor in Paris. Richard Derby said, "I shall never forget several days with my sister-in-law. She always took splendid care of anyone who turned up at her home." Theodore Roosevelt Jr. and Quentin Roosevelt were with Eleanor just a couple days before he was shot down. I probably should have spoke while this was playing, so I apologize. But this is, these videos, by the way, are all available at the Library of Congress, loc.gov. One of the interesting things about Eleanor, I wasn't going to mention in the talk, but while it's playing, after Quentin was killed, and Quentin's coming up next on the queue to talk about, actually Kermit is, the 3 Roosevelt women, Grace, Belle, and Eleanor, had made a pact that whoever has the next son is going to name him Quentin in honor of their brother-in-law. So by all accounts, I think the next in line to have a child would have been Belle Willard, but Eleanor had her son 2 months premature. And as a result, she was able to name him Quentin. This is Kermit Roosevelt. I know Clay will be speaking about Kermit on Saturday. We don't have a lot of artifacts for Kermit. We have them for Archie, we have them for Ethel, we have them for Theodore Roosevelt Jr., because all of those families were so heavily involved with the establishment of Sagamore Hill. Where Kermit, his artifacts are in different places. His papers are at the Library of Congress. I think some of his artifacts are still within the family. What makes him interesting is he entered with the British Army. And he entered with the British Army when the U.S. had entered because of his lack of experience. The other two speakers had spoke about the Plattsburgh camps, the preparedness camps. The other three brothers were involved with them, really from 1915 on. Where Kermit, he was living in Buenos Aires and working at a bank. So because of his lack of experience, the American Expeditionary Force wasn't going to provide him any sort of rank. So he had entered with an armored unit in present-day Mesopotamia. He did receive the British Military Cross for his efforts, which he quoted as saying was awfully nice. Kermit was transferred to the American Expeditionary Force by May of 1918 as a captain of field artillery. When he transferred, his wife Belle said she was excited. She has the unbelievable hope of perhaps seeing you so soon, but at the same time she had the agony of having you in the midst of the slaughter in France. Kermit was the only son that managed to get out unscathed. Archie was wounded, Ted was wounded and gassed. Kermit wrote a great book called War in the Garden of Eden. Patricia O'Toole gives an account of it in her book, When Trumpets Call. If you've ever read The Rough Riders, which historians of jokes said should be titled Alone in Cuba, by Theodore Roosevelt, Roosevelt wants you to focus more on him in the book, where Kermit's account of the War in the Garden of Eden, he doesn't want you to focus on him. He wants you to focus on the world around him. He wants you to reflect on his experiences in Mesopotamia with the British Army and the people that he encountered while he was in Mesopotamia. This is Quentin Roosevelt. As you all know, he was the youngest of the children. Sometimes we take for granted how young. I know there's a couple college students in this room right now. I know Simon introduced me, and he said that his father was in the Air Force. Kermit Roosevelt was a pilot at age 20. He was flying a plane. He had left Harvard early to enter the war. And when he decided to enter, he got secretly engaged to Flora Whitney Payne. He was assigned to the 1st Pursuit Group. These photos of him, I believe, were taken on Long Island in Mineola, where there was an airfield complex, but today it's a large shopping mall, if you've ever been over in that area. These are some of the artifacts we have related to Quentin. We have his flying cap, which is proudly on display in our museum, but we also have his lieutenant's bar and his wings. This is one of my favorite things to look at Sagamore Hill, if you've been there and explored the property, is I always look at the bench and think of all the history. This bench is just outside of the North Room, and this photo was taken of Flora and Quentin shortly before he left. When Quentin was killed on July 14th, 1918, there was a lot of misinformation on whether he was actually killed or not, because there was a lot of accounts of American soldiers witnessing him land behind German lines. Theodore Roosevelt, he had a hunch that he was killed, but he did go on with some of his engagements. For instance, just a day after receiving word that he was potentially killed, he gave a speech at the Republican convention for the governor's race in New York up in Saratoga Springs. We take for granted how fast letters come to us today, especially with email. Weeks after Quentin's death, there was letters still coming in to the family from Quentin describing what he was witnessing over there. Letters to the mom and dad, letters to Flora. Quite a few of these letters you can find at the Theodore Roosevelt Center website if you haven't already looked at them. To the left is Quentin's grave. I think there's a photo over there of Quentins Grave initially. It was just a basic cross set up by the German soldiers. It became a pilgrimage site for American soldiers. To the left is Quentin's grave, what it kind of evolved into over time. And at some point, nobody seems to be 100% sure when, Quentin's grave marker found its way back to Sagamore Hill. Quentin is still buried in France. He was moved to Omaha Beach, the American Cemetery to Omaha Beach with his brother Theodore Roosevelt Jr. And after they moved his body, they moved the marker back here. It's an interesting site for reflection. The VFW and the American Legion every Memorial Day have a ceremony at the Quentin grave marker at Sagamore Hill. This is Theodore Roosevelt's last outdoor speech, which is just about a month and a half after Quentin was killed. As Simon mentioned, I am a Ravens fan. I am from Baltimore. So I enjoy this video a great deal because it was filmed in the old Oriole Park in Baltimore. One of the things I'm always struck by with TR is how close of a talker he was. I don't know if you've ever noticed that on the videos, but people didn't seem to mind. In this film, you can see he's wearing a black armband, mourning Quentin's loss. He did remain active. His valet, James Amos, had said he did not weep or talk about it, but to me, who had been used to watching his every movement for years, knew him well, knew it was plain that he was a changed man after Quentin's death. One of the interesting things that Theodore Roosevelt had done during the war, besides the Liberty bond drives, the Liberty loan drives, which was taking place in that film, is he took his Nobel Peace Prize money, which originally Congress was supposed to establish an industrial peace foundation. When he wasn't satisfied with the work being done, he took the money back and he gave all of it out to organizations like the Red Cross, the YMCA War Council, the Italian Red Cross, and even the Salvation Army. Edith observed the last couple months of his life. The sorrows of the world bore heavily on Theodore. He did check into the hospital the day after the war had officially ended on November 11th, 1918. He spent the remaining couple months of his life in Roosevelt Hospital. When he was discharged, he said, "I'm feeling bully, and I was treated fine at the hospital. The sciatica got the best of me, but I'm feeling all right." That Christmas, when he was released, he broke one of his long-established traditions, which is mentioned in Mr. Thompson's book, how he would go to the local Cove School and give out gifts to children. That year, Archie, who was still recovering from his own wounds, had gone to the Cove School in place of his father, Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt died at Sagamore Hill the morning of January 6, 1919. His valet, James Amos, was at his side when he passed away. William Howard Taft, upon receiving word of Theodore's death, wrote to Edith, "The United States has lost a great patriotic American, a great world figure, the most commanding figure in our public life since Lincoln." That's all I have. Wake up, please.
Thank you.
Shifty microphone.
Sorry, yeah, keep it high. Thank you, Josh. Do you have questions for Josh Reyes from Sagamore Hill? I know it was a romp through the family's participation. What's so amazing about it is how many of the Roosevelts got their way into the war. It's as if, TR wanted his sons in the war, but he didn't necessarily want everyone, but there was a kind of almost an exodus of Roosevelts to France.
Right, the Roosevelt women were, as I said, just as stubborn as him. He didn't really want the women to be in it, but they thought it was their duty, nonetheless. And as I said, it's hard to really capture any of their contributions in 30 minutes. But as my old professor said, history is the art of deciding what to leave out. So I gave you what I could in 30 minutes.
We appreciate that. Go ahead. how
The
are
Roosevelt family?
TR descendants in upholding his legacy?
Yes, the family, 3 of them lived until 77, 79, and 1980. And that's what really separates Theodore Roosevelt from the guy that came before him, William McKinley. McKinley's 2 daughters didn't live past infancy. William McKinley's wife didn't live past a year or 2 after his death. So the memory of William McKinley is lost, where Theodore Roosevelt, not only did they all live a very long time, not only did they all have very prominent lives, whether it's his children that survived the war, his sisters, but they all wrote. They wrote so many books. Corinne, my brother Theodore Roosevelt. I mentioned a couple books written by the children, War in the Garden of Eden, and in every one of the books, somewhere along the line, they bring back into their father's name and the impact he had on shaping them into who they were. Still active. Just before Sagamore Hill closed its doors in December of 2011 for our extensive 3-year renovation, we had Theodore Roosevelt IV, Theodore Roosevelt V, and Theodore Roosevelt VI, who was 1 year old, take a tour of the home. So they still come around. And that's what really makes it neat to work there.
In the back, yes. So the postcards began to come to Sagamore from Europe of a purported corpse of Quentin at the site of the crash, and we're asking how authentic that is. What do you know about this?
I've never really heard any argument otherwise, to be honest. And maybe I'm in the dark on that. It's a tough photo to look at, whether it is Quentin or if it was somebody staged as Quentin, because it is somebody's child next to that plane. And I thought about putting that photo in, but I figure anybody really interested in seeing the body next to the plane could just find it on the internet on their own time.
But it's circulated pretty widely.
It's circulated pretty widely, and there's different interpretations of why it was. The Germans argued they were honoring Quentin in a war fought in the trenches. There was a book I read. I think they referred to pilots during the Great War as the knights in the sky. It was kind of the only movement that was starting to happen at a certain point, where these guys are deadlocked, but they could look up and see something. So they were all very respectful of Quentin. The fact that he was a former president's son, and the fact that he was a pilot, which is something new to warfare at the time.
But the Roosevelt family was not offended by this photograph when it came. They absorbed it, and they believed that it was authentic.
Yes.
Other questions?
Yeah, light's bright.
Am I missing anyone? Sorry?
Yeah.
Any other questions at this point? Well, then let's move. Here's one. Sorry, go ahead. Military after the World War I.
Yes. We could have done a whole symposium on the Roosevelt family in World War II if we really wanted. There's Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was a brigadier general in the Second World War. You could do a whole symposium on Theodore Roosevelt Jr. alone, whether it's on the interwar period of him as governor of New York, governor of Puerto Rico and governor of the Philippines, or as I said, him as brigadier general. And there's a great photo of Theodore Roosevelt Jr. with his son Quentin Roosevelt over in Normandy, not too long before he had died of a heart attack. So yes, they were involved in the Second World War, and same with the women. They were all, Ethel and Eleanor Butler Roosevelt were with the Red Cross during the Second World War, giving the same 100% effort that they gave in the First World War.
I'll talk a little bit about Kermit's role tomorrow, but Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was in the First World War and was sufficiently wounded that he was officially announced as disabled and unfit for combat, and he had to twist arms and cheat a little bit to get into World War II. He was in North Africa, and he was at D-Day, and then he died about 5 weeks of a heart attack 5 weeks after D-Day. So if you ever seen the wars or the films of The Longest Day and so on, Henry Fonda, I think, plays Theodore Roosevelt Jr. in that.
Well, I think it's, like I said, because Ethel lived in Oyster Bay, home of Sagamore Hill until 1977. Archie had a home in Cold Spring Harbor next to Oyster Bay until 1979. They were happy to give everything they could. In the case of Kermit dies in 1943 while serving on active duty in Alaska. And his wife, Belle Willard, she lived until 1964. And for whatever reason, if you look at the context at the time, Sagamore Hill doesn't get established as a federal site really until 1962. So it just may have never occurred to her to start handing things over. I mean, I know that Kermit Roosevelt's grandchildren, they've been involved with the site to some extent. They've stopped by for tours. But I don't really have a good answer on why they ultimately. It's not that we don't have any Kermit stuff. We do have World War II Kermit stuff. We just don't have a lot for World War I for whatever reason.